Yeah.
All right. This week's address is Parshas Chayei. At the end of Parshas Chayei, the Torah speaks about Yitzchak. Yitzchak l'suach b'sada. The Gemara in Brachas tells us in Sicha el Tefillah, and it was Lefnos Erev. So Yitzchak instituted the mitzvah of davening Mincha. And Shacharis, we know from this past week's Sedra, was instituted by Avram. Avram gets up in the morning, El Hamakom Asher Amat Sham Berishona, to the same place where he stood previously. And the Gemara tells us, Ein Amida L'Tfilah. So he was davening, and it was Baboker, it was when he got up, and he went directly to the place he davened, that he was davening, in order to daven. So there we see that he instituted Tfilah Shacharis. And Yaakov in Parshas Vayetze, the Yivka B'Makom, he encountered Makom at the place, or Makom is one of the names of HaKadosh Baruch Hu also. Ein Pikiya El Tfilah. So he encountered God in a form of tefillah, in the form of davening, in the form of prayer. So prayer, the three prayers of the day, was instituted by Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Now, there is a discussion in the Gemara whether tefillos keneged avos tiknum or tefillos avos tiknum. There are two texts. Or keneged karbanos tiknu, correspond with the sacrifices. And according to the conclusion of the Gemara, there are two opinions. There is an opinion that seems to be the opinion of the Lechem Mishnah, is that according to the conclusion of the Gemara, the tefillos are regular tefillos, shacharis, mincha, ma'ariv, correspond with the tefillos, with the prayers of the patriarchs. Shacharis with Avram, Mincha with Yitzchak, and Ma'ariv with Yaakov. But later on, at the time of the second Beis HaMikdash, the Chachamim instituted that in addition to being identified with the prayers of the patriarchs, the prayers should also correspond with the sacrifices of the day. There was the morning korban, the morning sacrifice, daily sacrifice. There was the afternoon sacrifice. And the evening was the burning of parts of the animals that were sacrificed to God. And that corresponds with Ma'ariv. So it corresponds with both. And there is an opinion that there is a disagreement at the end, that some say it corresponds with both, and some say only with the sacrifices. Okay, whatever it is, but there's at least an opinion, and perhaps that's the conclusion of the Gemara as well, that the different philos, the different prayers, correspond with the different patriarchs. It's interesting, not that it's always done, but in the Siddur, the davening starts off with Adon Olam, Shacharis, and it concludes also with Adon Olam. I don't see it except on Shabbos that it should conclude with Adon Olam in practice. But apparently that was the practice, that Shacharis should start with Adon Olam and conclude with Adon Olam. Why is it that way? So in a certain sitter, at the time of the Vilna Gaon, it was suggested, and the Vilna Gaon praised it, because Shacharis was instituted by Avram. And the Gemara says that Avram was the first one to declare God as Adam, as the master of the world. So therefore, at Shacharis is associated with the singing of Adon Olam. But in any case, the Tfilos correspond with the Avos, whether they instituted it or was instituted corresponding to the Tfilos that they daven, but it's associated with the Avos, with the patriarchs. So the question is, why was it important for the Tfilos to be associated with the patriarchs? Now, there is a very difficult Rambam. Reb Chaim discusses it. It's well known. The Rambam seems to contradict himself. In one place, he says that davening needs kavanah. Davening, meaning the Shemona Esrei, requires kavanah, requires concentration, requires focus. And in another place, he says, of course, it's always good to have kavanah throughout the whole davening. But if somebody has kavanah in the first bracha, b'di'evid, after the fact, that is good also. And the question is, there seems to be a contradiction. When he says davening requires kavanah, it seems that the whole Shemona Esrei requires focus, requires some form of intention, not just the reading of the words. And in the other place, he says that after the fact, focus and concentration only affects the davening in terms of the fulfillment of the mitzvah in the first bracha. But afterwards, while it's certainly preferable, but after the first bracha, even if you don't have concentration and focus, you fulfill the mitzvah of davening. And to answer that question, Reb Chaim said, there are two types of concentration, two types of focus, two things to bear in your mind when you say Shemona Esrei. One is kavanah omed lifnei hashchina. A person has to realize when he's davening Shemona Esrei that he is standing before God. If he doesn't have that concentration, that focus, so in reality, he's not talking to God. He's talking to the wall. And the definition of tefillah, of prayer, is talking to God. So if one, Reb Chaim says, any part of the Shemona Esrei that you don't keep in mind that you're talking to God, it's like you didn't say those words of the Shemona Esrei. And if there is a bracha that one didn't focus, that didn't have that focus, so according to Reb Chaim's explanation of the Rambam, it's like he didn't say that bracha. So you would have to go back to that bracha and continue the Shemona Esrei from that point onward. But there is another focus, another form of concentration that is important, but not as important. And that is Perish Hamilah. A person should try to understand where it's possible. Where it's impossible, it's impossible. There's nothing you can do about it. Of course, if someone can't understand the meaning of the words, either because of lack of background, we tell them daven anyway. But if someone is capable of understanding the meaning of the words, So he's required, at least in the first bracha of the Shemona Esrei, in the first blessing of the Shemona Esrei, to try to understand what he's saying. Of course, it would be preferable for a person to understand every bracha, what he's saying. But if one is capable of doing it, it is a necessary requirement in the first bracha of Shemona Esrei. So now this Reb Chaim is somewhat strange. And that's how Reb Chaim answers the Rambam. He answers the Rambam that when the Rambam says that after the fact, all you need is kavanah, concentration and focus in the first bracha of Shemona Esrei, he's talking about the focus and concentration on the meaning of the words. But when he says, implies that one has to have concentration and focus throughout all the 19 brachos of Shemona Esrei. So then he's talking about the realization that you're standing before God. Now the question is, I would understand if Reb Chaim would have said that if a person has focus on the fact that he's standing before God in the first bracha, that even if he really doesn't focus on that in the other brachos, but since he began the Shemona Esrei with that focus and with that concentration, so it's considered that he had that focus and that concentration throughout all the other brachos. And in fact, my uncle and the Chazon Ish seem to explain the Rambam in that manner. But when we talk about Perish HaMilim, about the meaning of the words, of understanding what you're saying, you can't suggest that because you understood the words in the first bracha of Shemona Esrei, halachically it's considered that you understood the meaning of the words in the other brachas of Shemona Esrei. It's different words, different ideas. So how is it that there is a requirement that there is a greater requirement of understanding the words in the first bracha of Shemona Esrei than in the other brachos of Shemona Esrei? Now, I think that the answer to this question against Reb Chaim's explanation of the Rambam is very simple. But I want to introduce it with a thought of my uncle's that I've mentioned previously. My uncle would say that when we approach God on Yom Kippur, we approach him in two different manners. We approach him as an individual, and we approach him as a nation. And there's a difference. When we approach God on Yom HaKippurim, when we approach God on Yom HaKippurim as a nation, so then when we approach God on Yom HaKippurim as a nation, then we are sure that God will answer us, that God will forgive us, that we will attain kapara. But when we approach God as an individual, then it's with fear and trepidation. And my uncle would mention that he remembered that when he was in Berlin, when they said the vidui, the confessional prayer on Yom Kippurim, so when the individual said it in his private Shemona Esrei, in his quiet Shemona Esrei, many of the individuals would cry when they said the vidui, as if they weren't sure that God will accept their prayer or their request for forgiveness. But when the Chazan repeated it, so it was almost sung by the Chazan and the members of the tzibur, the members of the congregation, in a happy tone. Why? Because then they were sure that God would repeat it. Because when the Chazan repeats the Shemona Esrei, and the Kohol and the congregation listens to him, they're not coming as individuals. They are coming as the Jewish people, as the Jewish nation. And there is a bris, there is a covenant between God and the Jewish nation. A covenant with the Avos, with the patriarchs. Abraham, God made a covenant with Avraham, with Yitzchak, and with Yaakov. And what is a covenant? A covenant is a contract. And when you have two parties to a contract, even if one party is a large company and the other party is an individual worker who has the lowest of jobs, to the extent of the contract, the person who has the lowest of jobs has a lien on the company. And my father, I heard from my father, and I saw it also in the writings of my uncle, that when we say in the Shemona Esrei, Elokei Abraham, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, in the first brach of Shemona Esrei, on one hand, of course, we mean the God that Abraham recognized, that Abraham accepted, that Abraham followed, that Abraham submitted to. And the same in regard to Yitzchak and Yaakov. But an additional explanation is the God that belonged to Abraham, the God that belonged to Yitzchak, the God that belonged to Yaakov. How is it that God belonged to Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov? Because there was a covenant between Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob on one hand, and God on the other hand. But my uncle suggested that to invoke the covenant of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, to feel sure that the covenant is enforced, we can't come just as individuals. We have to come as the Jewish people. So, because of that, the vidui, when it was said by the Kohol, who represent the Jewish people, who symbolize the Jewish nation, so it was a sense of joy and happiness because they felt sure they would be answered. And while it's true, there is a greater feeling of encouragement, of feeling that we will succeed when we come as the Jewish nation. But even when we come as individuals, I think, but we come as the descendants of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, with whom God made a covenant, we have a stronger claim than if we just come as individuals who are not connected to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I think that's why the first bracha is so significant for Shemona Esrei. That's why there is a requirement, not only in the first bracha to understand for who you're standing, but you have to know who you are. By what right you come to ask of God? Now, it's true. davening is something that God allowed all of man to do. My house will be called a house of God, will be a house of prayer for all the nations of the world. But for the descendants of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, they come on a stronger footing. They come with the bris, with the covenant of their ancestors. And because of that, the Chachamim instituted that of all the brachas in the Shemona Esrei, so the bracha of Avos, the first bracha, where you explain by what authority you come, how you can come so close to God to request. So because of that, the Chachamim were more stringent in their requirement of understanding the words of that bracha. So, and all this is based, and that's the reason why we could suggest that it was so important that Tfilos Avos Tiknum, that the Tfilos should be formulated, not the text of the Tfilos, but the requirement to daven, according to many opinions, was instituted by the patriarchs. Why? In other words, to emphasize the bris, the covenant between the patriarchs and God, because it's that covenant that gives us the ability to have strength in our requesting for God's help. Now, but it's very interesting, at the end of this week's Sedra, the Torah tells us that Yitzchak instituted Mincha. Where do we see that Yitzchak instituted Mincha? Because it says, Vayetze Yitzchak l'suach b'sadeh. And the way the Mefarshim explain, it's not just the drasha. It's the simple explanation of the words. So Yitzchak went to the Sadeh to daven. Why did he go to the Sadeh? I think I've mentioned before, because Yitzchak came to recognize God. Yitzchak came to recognize God by looking at nature. The Rambam says, how does one come to love God? How does one come to recognize God and to love God? By looking at the world. So Yitzchak felt special closeness to God, basada in the fields. So because he felt a special closeness to God in the fields, so because of that, when he went to daven, when he instituted Tfilas Mincha, he would go out to the fields, to the Sadeh. But in any case, so it was Yitzchak who instituted Tfilas Mincha. But Tosfos, both in Brachas and in Yuma, mentions the Gemara in Yuma that says that Salusa da Avram, the prayer of Avram, was at noontime. And so he says, now, so Avram, okay, the Gemara in Yuma is troubled by the fact that Mincha can only be a half hour afternoon. But it seems that Avram davened Mincha. So Tosfos says either that Avram davened Mincha, but he didn't institute it as a requirement for the member of his household, or Tosfos, or it's Avram davened Mincha after Yitzchak instituted it. I want to use. I'm more inclined that Avram davened Mincha, as you'll see, even before Yitzchak instituted as a tefillah. But the question is, where do our sages know that Yitzchak daven mincha? Well, Rabbi Yosef, it was Rabbi Yosef who said that Yitzchak daven mincha at chatzos, at noon. Where do we know? Where do we see that Avram daven mincha at noon? Where do we see that he daven mincha at noon? We could suggest that Rabbi Yosef had a Masorah about that. But I don't want to go into why I think not. But it's difficult to assume that, because if it was based on a Masorah, it would be difficult to disagree. And it does not seem that everybody agrees that he davened mincha at noon. So I want to suggest that it could be that Avram daven mincha at noon, we see from the beginning of last week's Sedra, Parshas Vayera. Now, I know that most of the Rishonim do not explain the pasuk that way, but I think that Rabbi Yosef, the one who suggested that Avram daven mincha at noon, suggested that because he saw that as one way to understand the psukim. Vayera Hashem elav v'hu yoshev pesach ha'oel kechom hayom. Avram, God appeared to Avram. V'hu yoshev pesach ha'oel, he was sitting, and that's significant, at the entranceway to his tent, kechom hayom, like the heat of the day. Now, there is some question as to what kechom hayom means. But from the Gemara in Brachas, it seems that kechom hayom was shah shishis, the 6th hour of the day. On an equinox day, that would be from 11 to 12. So the day starts at 6 and ends at 6. So from 11 to 12 would be the 6th hour of the day. Still too early to daven mincha. But I think I could explain it. Now, the Rambam says that a person has to sit, and I'll go more in length in that, before he starts davening. In order to focus his concentration, in order to have a serious attitude when he davens. So the Rambam says that a person, in the sense to prepare himself, not start davening right away, but sit before he starts the davening. And the Gemara tells us that Chassidim Harishonim, the early pious ones. Avram was certainly an early pious person. He was the first. So Chassidim Harishonim would wait an hour before they started davening, in order that they should have the proper attitude, prepare themselves for the davening. So we could suggest that Avram was sitting, I know the Ramban seems to say not that way, but we could suggest there's a possibility that Avram was sitting an hour before. But why? But it says, Vayera Elav Hashem, God appeared to him. What's the idea behind it? Now, and matter of fact, I think there is an indication in the psukim. Of course, the Mefarshim explained the psukim somewhat differently. God appears to Avram in the 6th hour of the day. And then the Malachim come by And Avram asks God to wait. There are two explanations in Rashi as to exactly what Avram said. Maybe he wasn't talking to God, but he interrupts his preparation for davening. And he runs to take care of the malachim. And then later on, after the malachim leave Avram, the pasuk says, "Avram adayin omeid b'fnei Hashem." Avram was still standing before God. Remember, the word standing, according to the Gemara in Parshas, ain't a mida el tefillah, but he was still standing. So it seems there's a discussion in the Mefarshim, what does a dayin omeid? And there's some, Rashi says it's tikkun sofer. Whatever tikkun sofer means. I don't want to get into it now. It'll be a shir in itself. But we could read the pasuk that, in other words, since he was getting ready to daven. And daven is omeid lefnei Hashem, standing before God. So in a certain sense, and the Medrash says that there, Yoshev, the Medrash points out that Yoshev is written without a vav, is Yoshav. An implication perhaps that he did get up, even though the Medrashim say that HaKadosh Baruch Hu told him to remain sitting, but it could be that he did get up to stand before God. And then it says afterwards, he's still standing before God. It was a continuation of the tefillah that he was initiating in the 6th hour of the day. And then in the morning, and that's when he pleaded on behalf of Sdom in that tefillah. Some say, I think the Sforna says that in that tefillah he pleaded on behalf of Lot. So then in the morning, Vayakam Avram Baboker El Hamakom Asher Amad Sham Barishona. He went to the place that he stood there. So in other words, and there we say clearly that it was tefillah shacharis. So there is reason to assume that one could assume that the first encounter that Avram had with God was an encounter of davening. And he sat there early because in order to prepare himself for the davening. Now, I want to explain this at length. The Rambam in Hilchos Shabbos, Perek Gimel, Halacha Gimel, he talks, Perek Lamed, Halacha Gimel, Halacha Beis, So he talks about what is Kavod Shabbos. How does Kavod Shabbos, showing respect and regard for Shabbos, manifest itself? So he says, first of all, there is a mitzvah, so in Halacha Beis, he says there's a mitzvah to wash your hands, your face, your feet, your legs, your feet in warm water because of Shabbos. And he says you should wear umisate betzitzis. You should wear a talis. The Yoshe becovered rosh, mechel hakmolas pnei shchina. You have to have a serious attitude. And he says, and the chachamim harishonim, the early chachamim, they used to gather their students, and they would go out to greet the Shabbos. Hayumekabtzin talmideihen B'erev Shabbos, u'misatfin, and they would wear their talis. V'amru bo v'neitzei l'kras Shabbos hamelech. Let us go out to King Shabbos. And who is King Shabbos? I mean, it goes without saying, but my uncle mentioned this year, that's God. God manifests himself in the Shabbos, in the Kedusha of Shabbos. And then, then there are other laws of Kavod Shabbos. There's a halacha of wearing special clean clothes on Shabbos and not to eat right before the Shabbos because you should be have an appetite for Shabbos. The main meal should be Shabbos, I should say, and you should light candles, and the table should be set. The house should be made up, all that. But in the Halacha Beis, there he talks about the laws of Kavod Shabbos, the laws of showing regard for Shabbos as part of the act of welcoming the Shabbos, of welcoming the Shechina. Likras Shabbos Hamelech, going out to welcome or waiting for God to come. What's the idea behind this? And my uncle said, and in this respect, my uncle's different than most of the other Sfarim. Well, as far as Shabbos is concerned, in other words, Shabbos, God comes to us. God comes to us. The center of Shabbos is not the Beis Hamikdash. The center of Shabbos is our house. But when God comes to us, we have to wait for him. We have to show that we're waiting for him. We have to welcome him. It's called Kabbalah Shabbos. We accept him. So the idea of Shabbos, of sitting down and waiting for the Shabbos to come, that's part of showing that we're waiting for the Shabbos, looking forward to the Shabbos, and going out to greet the Shabbos. And what's interesting, my uncle pointed out that when it comes to davening, all these halachas that are associated with welcoming the Shabbos, all these halachas are associated with davening also. The Rambam in Hilchos Tefillah says, of course, you have to wash your hands before every davening. But the Rambam's opinion, I'm not saying we paskin that way, but the Rambam's opinion is that for Shacharis, which is the first of the three tefillas, that's a question why Shacharis should be the first of the three tefillas. If we say Avel stick them, we could understand it because some say that the before Matan Torah, the day halachically began with the day rather than at night. But even if we don't say that, it seems that in regard, certainly according to the Rambam, that in regard to the tefillah, to the mitzvah of tefillah, the day begins with the day and not with the night. Because from the Rambam and Sefer HaMitzvos, it appears that there is an Isur D'Oraisa, I'm not saying under all circumstances, but there is an Isur D'Oraisa to eat before Shacharis. So the question is, the mitzvah D'Oraisa of davening is once a day, at any time of the day. So why specifically before Shacharis? Obviously, the Rambam's opinion is that the day of davening, for whatever reason, begins with the day and concludes with the night. Now, so the Rambam says that for Shacharis, one has to be Rochetz Pana Yada V'Raglav. He has to wash his hands, his face, his hands, and his feet. And then as Atifas Tzitzis, the Rambam in Hilchos Tzitzis says that while it's a good thing for a person to wear clothes that have four corners, in order that he should fulfill the mitzvah of Tzitzis, A person should be especially careful during davening to do that. And Koved Rosh, the Rambam says a person has to have Koved Rosh. He has to have a serious attitude, respectful attitude. When he gets to daven, not from light-headedness, not from joking. Davening has to come from a serious attitude. Has to be toch koved rosh. And the Rambam says, "Lefichach tzarech adam in hilchos tefillah leishev ma'at kodem atefillah k'dei lechaving libo." Person should sit a little bit before he davens, in order that he should have the proper concentration, the proper focus when he davens. So seeing, just like by Shabbos, my uncle said, there is a halacha of Kabbalah's Pnei Shechina, of welcoming the divine presence. Davening, when there's a halacha of Omed Lifnei HaShechina, of standing before God, then there's also a halacha of Kabbalah's Pnei Shechina, of greeting the God. And so what's the idea? The idea is, just like by Shabbos, God comes to the Jew, so too by davening, God comes to the Jew. You find in the Minayin Shakadosh Baruch Hu Bal Beis HaKnesses, there's a difference between the shul and the Beis HaMikdash. The Beis HaMikdash is God's place, and we go to see God or to have a meeting with God there. But the shul is our place. So there we have the shul for God to come to have a meeting with us. He doesn't find 10 people. Miyadu koes. He gets angry right away. What's the idea of miyadu koes? But if you have an appointment and you don't show up on time to the appointment, if you went to the person's office, to the doctor's office, they're not that angry. They'll probably might charge you, but they're not that angry if you're not there on time. But if they make a meeting with you and they come to your place and you're not there, they will get angry right away. Shabbos, the shul. And what is true about the shul is true about davening also. God has a meeting with us. He comes to us. The shul is our place. And because he has a meeting with us and he comes to us and we're not there, miyadu koes, figuratively, he gets angry right away. He came to us. That's how we can understand that halacha. Now, and this is, we could suggest, Avraham. Why was Avraham sitting? This halacha that you have to sit before davening. This is halacha because God is coming to us and we are waiting for God. We show that we're looking forward to God's coming. We don't just answer the door and say, wait a second. And then when Yitzchak goes to the Sadeh, Yitzchak goes to the field. Some would go out to be Mechabel Pnei Shechina. They wanted to go not where they always were, in order to get this approach of God coming, because God is always there. So to change the scenery a little bit. So they go out, and especially if you go out to the fields, and especially one could suggest, the Gemara doesn't say to the fields, but if it was to the fields, we could understand What does Shabbos represent? Shabbos represents nature having been completed. And Shabbos, as the Mekubalim say, the Chassidus says, God became the nefesh of the world. So Shabbos, God becomes, in a sense, the soul of nature. So we are re-experiencing that first Shabbos of God entering the world. Especially if one says, there is an argument between Mekubalim and the Rambam in that, but especially if one says that the world was recreated every moment. So that idea of recreation of every moment is done in a complete process after the world is completely created. And when is that? That's on Shabbos. There is a difference between Bria and Yetzirah. Bria is the initial creation. Yetzirah is the keeping of the world going. And if the world is keeping going by virtue of the fact that the world is constantly recreated, Yesh Me'ayin, Shabbos represents that Yesh Me'ayin. And it represents the idea of God coming to us. And that's certainly true by Tefillah. So Yitzchak, Vayetze Yitzchak l'suach b'sadeh. Yitzchak went out to the field. In a sense, just like some of the Chachamim would go out with their Talmidim to be Mekabel Pnei Shechina. Yitzchak would also go out to be Mekabel Pnei Shechina. And Yitzchak perhaps went alone. He was a figure who was a withdrawn, religiously figure. He was the symbol of Kedusha, of holiness. Holiness is covered up, is hidden. The Torah tells us very little about Yitzchak. It talks a lot about Avraham. It talks a lot about Yaakov. But very little about Yitzchak. It hides Yitzchak. Kedusha is hidden. The Kodesh Kedoshim is covered up. The Beis HaMikdash is covered up. So, because of that, Tefillah is something, in a sense, that Yitzchak would go out to the field, in a sense, to re-experiencing the recreation of the world, of God as he manifests himself. It's like God makes a dira b'tachtonim, but each moment it's like a new dira b'tachtonim. And he experienced nature more in the fields than he did in his tent. So, but the question is, why is tefillah an act of waiting for God? Now, I already mentioned my father, my uncle's pshat, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov, the God that belongs to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, because of the bris, because of the covenant, because of the contract that exists between the God and the Jewish people. We have a certain lean on God when we daven to God. And that's why we start off with the bracha of Avos. Some say that Modim also has special significance. And there too, we refer to God as our God, the God of our ancestors. But in other words, we could suggest that there is a difference between the tefillah of a Jew, a tefillah, a davening, a prayer said by the children of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and a tefillah, although it's an important thing, the tefillah recited by those who are not descendants of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, by the other nations of the world, because the tefillah recited by us gives us, we have strength for that tefillah because of the bris, because of the covenant. Because of that, is demonstrative of the fact that we have strength. God comes to us when we daven. The nations of the world, they do have this koach of tefillah, power of tefillah, if they use it correctly and in the right manner. Ki beisi beis tefillah yikari l'chol amim. My home, my place of my house, the Beis Hamikdash, will be a place of prayer, not just for the Jewish people, but for all the nations of the world. Of course, they have to say the proper prayers, not prayers to Avodah Zarah, idolatry. But the non-Jew, when he prays to God, he has to go to God. We, because of the covenant that we have through the Avos, through our patriarchs, God comes to us. That's why just after the Bris Milah, just after the Bris Milah, after Avram became a Jew, we're told about Avram davening Mincha. Avram Shah Shishis, in the 6th hour, he prepared himself. He was Yoshev or Yoshav, Pesach HaOhel. But why? Because this represents the first prayer where God came to him, as opposed to him going to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And we have to realize that HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes to us. That puts the obligation upon us much stronger. We have to go and be mekabel the Shechina at the proper times, especially when it comes to davening with Tzibor, when it comes to davening with a minyan. We have to appreciate that God wants to come to us in order to hear our prayers. Okay.
If anyone has any questions, please put it here. But I just want to, your uncle's explanation that tefillah is Hashem coming to us is different than most people understand tefillah,
That's
right?
correct. That's correct.
What was his basis for understanding it that way?
Because he remarked that the halachas of Kavod Shabbos that have to do with God coming, rather than the way we should be on Shabbos, that the Rambam identifies with God coming, are the same halachas that apply to davening also.
Okay, if anyone else has a question, please put it in the chat.
Also, the Gemara Minayin Shakadosh Baruch Hu Bal Beis HaKnesses. He also he didn't discuss about Miyadu Koes, but the fact he just emphasized that God comes to the shore. The Miyadu Koes, that's something that I added.
So then, the different halacha that you should have a makom kavua is more significant to him than other people. It's also
the same idea. It's, in other words, the word makabel is like a shul. In other words, it's a special place that we have to meet God. It's not God's place. The makom kavua, it could be in your living room.
It does not look like we have any other oh wait, here's a question.
Okay.
If someone doesn't concentrate at all but davens in shul, does that help because a shul is for davening?
They mentioned that the Brisker Rav said that he thought, according to Reb Chaim Volozhiner, there is something accomplished with a davening, even if there is no concentration. That doesn't work so well with the Reb Chaim. I don't know if he felt the Reb Chaim Volozhiner disagreed with the Reb Chaim, or he agreed and had somehow a different approach. But there's certain, the Brisker Rav said that even if someone won't have concentration, he says from some thoughts that were expressed by Reb Chaim Volozhiner and the Nefesh HaChaim, it appears that the davening has significance anyway. I don't know that Reb Chaim would agree with that, though.
I guess with this approach, you could go in longer to explain the Mishkanos Yaakov.
Yeah, Mishkanos Yaakov says, yeah, that's correct. That you're davening for the tzibur. It's a little different, but there is a basis for it.
Right, okay. Okay, it doesn't look like there's any other questions, so thank you very much.